He kicked her out with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered heart. No explanation, no goodbye, just a slammed door and a silence that echoed louder than any scream. 6 years passed like shadows across glass, but when she returned, it wasn't to beg. It wasn't to explain. She stepped out of a black helicopter in a gown that shimmered like firelight, holding the hands of 2 children draped in gold. The red carpet beneath their feet wasn't for royalty. It was for reckoning. The crowd turned. Gasps floated through the air like whispers caught in wind. And at the far end, standing frozen in disbelief, was the man who had once discarded her like a mistake. She walked toward him slowly, her eyes steady, her presence radiant. No longer the woman he abandoned, but the force he never saw coming. "Tell us where you're watching from." And wait until you hear what she whispered when she stood face to face with the man who once threw her away. Amara Wells had once been the kind of woman who smiled softly and spoke gently, even when her world was burning behind her. At 32, she married Richard Wells, a man of stature, wealth, and charm, whose promises glistened like gold and whose love faded just as quickly. Brilliant in mind but quiet in spirit, Amara spent years in a gilded cage, her voice drowned out, beneath the weight of his ego. Richard, now 45, had everything: fortune, reputation, and control. But what he lacked was compassion. And when Amara discovered the truth, that he had been unfaithful, unapologetically so, she dared to confront him. His response was swift and cold. No second chances, no discussions, just a call to the driver, a suitcase at the door, and a cruel, final sentence: "Leave and don't come back." The mansion she was forced to walk away from stood like a monument to everything she lost: dignity, dreams, and the quiet hope of a better marriage. That night, she carried not only heartbreak but something far more delicate, a secret growing inside her that he would never know. Now, 6 years later, that same house trembled beneath the thunder of helicopter blades. The air smelled of roses and power. The lawn was flawless, the event extravagant, a fundraiser meant to showcase Richard's pristine public life. But the silence that once swallowed Amara had been replaced by something else entirely. She stepped out of the black helicopter draped in satin gold, a metallic belt cinching her waist like armor. In one hand, she held the delicate fingers of a boy in a cream tuxedo. In the other, the steady grip of a girl in a matching gown. Her children, his children, walked beside her with grace, unbothered by the cameras or the curious stares. The same house that once watched her leave in silence now echoed with the sound of rotors and reckoning. Her dress shimmered like justice stitched in silk. And the twins were not just symbols of her survival. They were his legacy, reborn under her protection and far beyond his control. It happened on a rainy night, the kind where everything felt heavier: air, silence, and heartbreak. Amara stood in the hallway of their vast marble mansion, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had to say. Her hands clutched her abdomen protectively, and her voice, though soft, carried the urgency of truth. "Richard, I'm pregnant," she whispered. But there was no joy in his eyes, no pause, no flicker of surprise. He barely looked up from his drink. "They'll never carry my name," he muttered coldly, like it was a curse, not a miracle. Her lips parted, stunned, but before she could find words, his tone grew sharper. "And you shouldn't still be here." It was the same night she'd caught him in his office, pressed far too close to his secretary, the scent of betrayal lingering in the air. Instead of shame, he wore arrogance. Instead of denial, he offered dismissal. "You always wanted more than you deserved, Amara," he sneered, waving her away like a problem he was tired of solving. Within the hour, her things were at the front door. No goodbye, no apology. Just the final thud of the gate closing behind her. She stood outside. In the rain, mascara running down her cheeks, her breath catching between sobs. The mansion loomed behind her like a cold fortress, its lights glowing in triumph. As the car drove her away, she looked down at her belly, placing her palm gently over the small life inside. "You will never know his cruelty," she whispered. "You'll never beg for his love." And then she vanished. No contact, no lawsuits, no scandal. Just silence. While Richard remarried a polished socialite to complete his public image, Amara rebuilt herself in shadows, quietly, deliberately. Years passed. His world remained untouched, shielded by wealth and reputation. Until the day of the fundraiser. The guests had barely finished their champagne toasts when the sound broke the sky. A helicopter. Black. Sleek. Descending like judgment from above. All heads turned as its blades cut through the air, scattering flower petals and unsettling polished hairstyles. Richard looked up from the podium, confused. His smile wavered. The crowd murmured. The helicopter landed directly behind the floral archway, a statement, not an accident. And when the door opened, and Amara stepped out in gold, with a child on each side, everything stopped. The whispers turned to gasps. The cameras began clicking, and Richard forgot how to breathe. The crowd parted like a tide as Amara walked forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble beneath the red carpet, each step deliberate and commanding. Her children moved beside her with grace beyond their years, one on each side, their small hands nestled in hers. Gasps rippled through the room like electric sparks. Guests clutched their pearls and murmured behind champagne glasses. The event's glitter faded beneath the rising tension, and at the far end of the terrace under a grand arch of roses, Richard Wells stood frozen, color draining from his face as recognition struck him like a blow. His new wife turned to him, confused, her perfect smile cracking as she watched the woman in gold approach with unsettling calm. Amara stopped only feet away, her presence silencing the music, the whispers, the lies. She looked at Richard, not with fury but with clarity, like someone who had outgrown the need for permission. Her voice was soft but carried weight. "Meet your children, Richard," she said, gesturing to the twins standing proudly at her sides. "You left us both, but they grew without needing your name." Richard's lips parted, disbelief flickering into defense. "You can't just show up here," he began, his voice breaking under the pressure of unraveling control. Amara didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, her expression serene, unbothered. "You don't get to dictate the ending after writing me out of the first act," she replied, her words measured, slicing through the air with the precision of truth. The crowd around them had fallen into stunned silence. Phones were discreetly lifted. Guests who once worshipped Richard now stared at him like they'd never really known the man behind the curtain. The twins stood tall, unafraid, eyes reflecting the quiet strength they inherited from the woman beside them. Amara didn't look at the cameras. She didn't need to. Every part of her, her gown, her posture, her peace, spoke louder than headlines. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here to return what he threw away. Truth. The silence that followed Amara's words was louder than applause, heavier than shame. Richard stood there, stunned, searching her face for any trace of the woman he once thought he controlled. But she was no longer his reflection of silence. She was the echo of everything he tried to erase. Slowly, Amara turned to the stage where the evening spotlight had once centered on him. She raised a hand, and one of the event staff stepped aside as her daughter, elegant in white with eyes that mirrored her mother's strength, took the microphone. The crowd leaned in, expecting a toast or perhaps an apology. Instead, the girl began to speak, calmly, confidently. "This is for the women who rise after being broken," she said. "For the mothers who are silenced, for the voices that rebuild in secret, and for the truth that outlives every lie." Her words pierced the air like arrows wrapped in velvet. Even those who didn't know the full story felt the weight of it. Richard stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" he asked, desperation now spilling through the cracks of his once pristine image. He looked around at the guests, searching for an ally, but all he found were averted eyes and camera flashes. Amara faced him, steady. "Because my silence raised our children," she said. "Now my voice will raise the truth." That was when the real blow came. With a nod, she signaled to the board members seated near the front. One by one they stood, not for Richard, but for her. Amara continued, her tone still calm. "You thought I disappeared. What I did was rebuild. When your company's largest investor passed away, I was listed as their successor. I've spent years acquiring silent shares, piece by piece, and today I hold a controlling stake." Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to disbelief. Richard stumbled back a step. His empire, built on arrogance and illusion, had been taken from under his nose not with war, but with strategy. Amara hadn't come for revenge. She had come for restoration. Guests began to drift away from Richard's side, his donors retreating into the safety of neutrality. His new wife stood off to the side, expressionless, her perfect posture wilting. And in that moment, under the bright lights of his own event, Richard watched his empire collapse, not with fire, but with silence and truth. Amara stepped back to her children, their hands waiting. She had said what needed to be said. Justice had spoken not through rage, but through reckoning. In the weeks that followed, the headlines shifted, not from scandal, but from celebration. "Amara Wells appointed new chairwoman of Wells Enterprises," read one. Another declared, "Silenced no more, a CEO's redemption story." But for Amara, it wasn't about press. It was about purpose. She stepped into her role with quiet authority, not seeking to dismantle everything Richard had built, but to rebuild it with the foundation it had always lacked: integrity. Her first act as chair was to announce a new internal equity policy. Her second was the creation of a fund, the Phoenix Grant, dedicated to helping single mothers, survivors of emotional abuse, and women who had been silenced like she once was. Her message was simple: no one rises alone. The twins flourished under her care, blossoming into reflections of her strength. Her son, introspective and brilliant, took to innovation and strategy, while her daughter, bold and unwavering, spoke often at school forums about justice and personal power. Amara never hid the truth from them. They grew up knowing their story, not as one of shame, but of triumph. One led with quiet wisdom, the other with fierce conviction, but both always walked free. In a televised interview that aired nationwide, Amar sat poised in a navy blazer, her children just off camera. The interviewer leaned in. "Was this revenge?" they asked. She smiled gently, unshaken. "No," she replied. "I didn't come back for revenge. I came back to reclaim my narrative." Meanwhile, far from the spotlight, Richard watched alone from a private lounge, uninvited, unmissed. The room around him was quiet, too quiet, now that applause belonged to someone else. His hands, once firm with control, trembled slightly as he reached for a remote he didn't press. On the screen, Amara stood center stage with her children, being honored at a women's leadership gala. She looked radiant, commanding, fulfilled. The same hand that once pushed her out now clutched empty air. She had returned, but not to beg. She came to reign. He thought she'd vanish, that her silence meant defeat. But she wasn't disappearing. She was becoming. And when she returned, she didn't knock. She arrived like a sunrise, radiant, unstoppable, and impossible to ignore. Her comeback wasn't loud. It was precise. It was the kind of power that doesn't need validation, because it's born from truth. In reclaiming her name, her voice, and her legacy, Amar didn't just change her world. She shattered the illusion that women like her must stay broken to stay quiet. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who swore they knew your limits? What would you do if you had one moment to walk back into the room they threw you out of? If this story hit home, share it. And if you believe in rising without asking for permission, stick around. We're just getting started. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one, where survival becomes power and silence becomes a roar.